In 1844, the Czar of Russia issued a ban on traditional Jewish clothing worn by Eastern European Jews for centuries, leaving the community with a dilemma. Should they adhere to their cultural customs or comply with the government's decree?
There's a story that is told about the chassid named Peretz Chaim. This story appears in a kuntres that's called Ramach Eisius. The kuntres Ramach Eisius is an interesting pamphlet or booklet of stories that was put together sometime in the early 1900s in Russia, and it was like an unofficial publication of stories. It's existed for a long time now, and a lot of valuable information is there. And this story about the Peretz Chaim is in this booklet called Ramach Eisius. What does it say there? It says that one time the Peretz Chaim came to the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. So this is sometime in 1850s. Let's assume sometime in the 1850s, 1840s, or the 1850s, maybe the early 1860s. The Peretz Chaim comes to the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, together with a chassid who was wearing clothes that were not the typical Hasidic clothing, unusual clothing, or more modern clothing. The Tzemach Tzedek did not recognize this other chassid, and he asked the Peretz Chaim, "Who is this other chassid that you're with?" So the Peretz answered, "This is Reb Leib Yoels, that's his name." So the Tzemach Tzedek said as follows, das is Leibke Yoels, as ich wollt wissen, as Levushim Poilin, as so viel, wollte ich sich wegen dem Meiser Nefesh given. This is Leibke Yoels. Had I known that clothes affects a person so much, then I would have had Mesidas Nefesh over this matter. So what's happening here? When we begin reading the story, we assume that Tzemach Tzedek doesn't recognize him because of his attire, because of his clothing. And that's the only reason that Tzemach Tzedek doesn't recognize him. But as the story reaches its crescendo at the end, we realize the reason that Tzemach Tzedek didn't recognize him is not because he was wearing this suit over that suit or this color shirt over that color shirt. It was because the Tzemach Tzedek was saying somehow the garments that he was wearing, the clothing that he was wearing, actually affected his personality. The Tzemach Tzedek was saying, I see into his personality and I see the change that happened in his personality. It's amazing to see how much clothing affects man. So this is a fascinating conversation about the psychology of clothing and how clothing indeed does affect the personality of a person and the behavior of a person. And the Tzemach Tzedek here is a moment to reflect and to notice and to say, wow, look how much clothing affects a person. I didn't even recognize him, namely what? His character. But then the Tzemach Tzedek said a second thing, and that is that had I known this, I would have had Mesidas Nefesh over this matter. What does that mean when the Tzemach Tzedek says that I would have had Mesidas Nefesh over this matter? So this is going to become clear as we move through today's class. Okay, so we have over here the memoirs of a woman whose name was Pauline Wennegroff. Pauline Wennegroff is a very important. She wrote a very important memoir. She lived from 1833 to 1916, and she lived in Brisk in Russia. So if you want, and she wrote a memoir toward the end of her life. She wrote a memoir and all about life, how it existed in Russia in the 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s. And so it's an invaluable resource to learning about this time period. She writes as follows. I'm going to read a few paragraphs from her account. The following happened on a Friday morning in the summer of the year 1845. I found myself in the marketplace of the city of Brest, that's Brisk, where many Jewish wives had gathered for shopping for the approaching Shabbos, when suddenly a great tumult broke out. Everyone was in confusion and thronged toward one point close by. Naturally, I also hurried to learn the cause of the uproar. From the crowd was heard laughter, now groaning. At last, I reached the scene and encountered a shocking sight. I saw a Jewish woman with a bare head, in the literal sense of the word, since her hair had been cropped off according to the Talmudic precept for married women, meaning her hair was cut off. It was then noyeg at this time for women to have very, very short hair, or maybe even to shave their heads. And so this is what I saw. This hapless victim stood there in this way, surrounded by the crowd, completely terrified on the one hand, on account of the sin of being bareheaded in public, and on the other hand, full of shame before the gaping crowd. With a voice choked by tears, she begged mercy of the policeman standing near her, who had torn off her head adornment and held it up high like a trophy and jiggled it, stirring the crowd to endless laughter. With one hand, the unfortunate woman tried to conceal her naked head with the corner of her apron, while with the second hand she rummaged around in her satchel to get out the prescribed Russian cap that was stored there. All the while, the woman cried in the most pitiable tone, "Panotzik, panotzik, here I have it. It is in the pocket of my clothes." She finally placed the cap on her bare head, which had horribly disfigured. Only then did the constable, meaning the police officer, compose himself and depart. So this is one account of a story that she tells us happened in the city of Brest in 1845. She then says another account. Soon destiny brought a second victim. This time it was a poor Jew who came to the marketplace in a long coat-tailed kaftan. A kaftan is like a long kapata, but envision it going down all the way to your feet. And coat-tailed is like where it gets divided in the back. The policeman greeted him derisively. While he called over a second policeman, he ordered the Jew, who was trembling from fear, to remain standing, seized the large shears that he always carried with him, and now, assisted by his colleague, cut off the long coattails of the kaftan in the style of a dress coat in which the pants became visible. So he cut off this long coat so that now this man's pants was visible. Before it was not. Then he tore off the poor man's head covering and cut off his payas so close to the ear that the poor man screamed from pain. Thereupon he let his victim go, and the market crowd gave the Jew thus converted the accompaniment of loud hooting, meaning referring to non-Jews who are in the marketplace. So this is a few passages of this account where she's writing about what's happening in 1845. What is going on over here? What's happening here is Tsar Nicholas, in the year 1844, passed a law. We all know of Tsar Nicholas's law about the Cantonists. This is where he said that every Jewish community had to give a certain number of Jewish children that could be conscripted to the army for 25 years. That's one of the terrible gzeiras that he initiated in Russia. Another terrible gzeira that he initiated in Russia was in 1844, when he said that Jews have to stop wearing their traditional clothing. And Pauline Wennegroff in this book has an entire chapter dedicated to describing what the typical lavush was for a male and for a female, for a child and for an adult, on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. And there was very specific ways that people dress. So for example, the idea of wearing a suit or even a kapata where a man's legs would be visible on the street, that was unthinkable. They had this kaftan that would go all the way down. Buttons. There was no concept of buttons, for example. You would tie things with strings and with ribbon. The concept of buttons didn't exist. Likewise, many different areas of dress that perhaps we take for granted today, that are normal the way we dress today, was not the way they dressed then. And the Tsar passed laws that said that Jews can no longer wear their typical dress. This included women's head coverings, this included long payas, and many other elements of clothing. In fact, we have a similar story in our tradition about Reb Hillel Paritcher, where it's brought in numerous sources. One of them is in Shmuz V'Sipurim from Falakan, where he writes that one day Reb Hillel Paritcher was out on the street. A police officer saw him, grabbed him, started wrestling with him, and tried cutting off his payas. Reb Hillel Paritcher put his hands on his payas and didn't allow the police officer to do what he wanted to do, but he's struggling. And suddenly, this is a big problem, obviously. Suddenly, there is a Jewish tailor who came by. He knew the police officers. He knew the government officials in town. He intervened and he saved Reb Hillel Paritcher. It actually goes on. This story is a really interesting story because Reb Hillel Paritcher was so thankful to this person who intervened and saved him that Reb Hillel said, I commit to allow you to be buried next to me. And what happened was that Reb Hillel Paritcher passed away years later while he was traveling in Kherson, very far from the place of this incident. And this tailor had a relative in Kherson, the story goes. And years after Reb Hillel Paritcher came to visit his relative, and he suddenly passed away there. And the Chevra Kadisha wasn't available to bury him, so other people came. They took him to the cemetery. It was snowing. They couldn't really see exactly what they were doing. They buried him after the snow melted away. They realized what happened, and the Chevra Kadisha realized what happened. They're like, hey, you can't bury him next to Reb Hillel, such a big tzaddik. This is just a random person. But they went to the Rav to ask whether they could move him. The Rav said you have to do a chakira to find out. You have to do an investigation to find out who this person was. So they did, and they wrote back to the city, to Paritz or to Babrois, to one of the places where he originated from. And that's when they learned actually that in fact he had this story, and so it turned out to be this Meredik Ashkacha Pratis. But what the point is that we see that Reb Hillel Paritcher was violating these the laws, and he had his long payas, and in addition to having his long payas, we're pretty confident that he also wore the clothing that was traditional for Jews to wear, and he didn't heed this law, which is why he got into trouble on this at this particular time. Okay, so what do we need to discuss? Other than a matter of history, this in fact is a very important halachic discussion. And none other than the Tzemach Tzedek himself got involved in this halachic question. What was the halachic question? The halachic question was very simple. Is it permitted for Jews to change their clothing? On the one hand, you could say this is the tradition. Jews have been wearing clothing in a certain way for a long time. And maybe we should keep up that tradition. Maybe it's a mitzvah to keep up that tradition of wearing the clothing. Or do we say that given this gzeira, it's okay for us to go and to change the clothing? So let's have, the Tzemach Tzedek has two long tshuvas on this discussion, and let's see what the Tzemach Tzedek has to say. Tzemach Tzedek Siman Tzaddik Aleph, here we're going to list a number of sources. The Tzemach Tzedek has in this tshuva a number of sources that raise up the value of a Jewish lavush and talk about the fact that there needs to be the concept of a Jewish lavush. So let's see some of these sources. First is a pasuk in Sefanya that says as follows, Sefanya, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Ches. It's talking about a prophecy that will happen. This is a day where Hashem is going to exact retribution from wicked people. God is going to visit upon, which means he's going to punish the ministers and the princes. Obviously, it's talking about people who committed evil. And then the pasuk concludes and says, and all those who wear foreign clothes. So, what does this pasuk mean? At first glance, we're seeing here a verse that says that wearing a malbush nachri, foreign clothes, is unacceptable. Now the truth is, there's multiple interpretations to this verse. So for example, the Radak, Reb David Kimchi, brings a pirush from his father that this is actually part of the ministers and kings. It's actually explaining what is the sin of the ministers and kings. Why is God going to punish the ministers and princes? Because they were the types of people who, when they saw garments that were nice, they would take them away and they would steal them and they would wear them on their own. So they were wearing foreign clothes, meaning geganvete clothes, stolen clothing. That's how the father, the Radak, understands this pasuk. Now, if that's the interpretation, then it has no bearing on our issue. Likewise, Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel in his Targum says that it's actually a metaphor. Kala loivshim malbush nachri, those who wear foreign clothes, is a metaphor for those who gather together to serve idols. Okay, so that's the people, the demographic of people that God is going to take punishment from. However, on the other hand, you could say, I follow the literal reading of the verse, and indeed there was a Rav who lived at this time who was asked the question. His name was Reb Shlomo Kluger, one of the most famous Rabbanim. He did not live in Russia. He lived in Galicia, and so therefore the Gzeira didn't affect him. However, he wrote a tshuva on this, and he cited this pasuk and quotes this pasuk, like the Tzemach Tzedek does, but he's the one who said decisively that I think it follows the meaning that it refers to Jews who start wearing Gentile clothing. And the Tzemach Tzedek brings in his tshuva that if you look at some interpretations, you find that there's justification for this point of view. So that's source number one. Source number two. It says in the Sifri as follows. This is the Medrash called the Sifri on Bamidbar and Dvarim, and it says as follows. Shaloi Saimar, a Jew shouldn't say, Hoyo v'hem yotzim b'taga, because they, meaning the non-Jews, are going out with a toga. A toga was a type of garment that Romans used to wear. Afani eitze b'taga, so I'll too go out with a toga. Hoyo v'hem yotzim ba'argaman, because they're going out with purple wool. Afani eitze ba'argaman, I'll do the same. Hoyo v'hem yotzim b'tulsin, because they're going out with a certain type of helmet. Afani eitze b'tulsin. No, it is improper for a Jew to emulate the clothing of a non-Jew, and it gives here three examples that are unacceptable. This is a second source that seems to clearly indicate that Jews should be wearing distinctive clothing. Another source that Tzemach Tzedek brings is from Bereishis Rabbah, Parsha Pei Beis, where it says as follows. There were two students, Shnei Talmidim of Rabbi Yeshua, and Shinu Atifasan, they changed the way they wore a cloak, B'shas Hashmad, during the time of Shmad, during the persecution. We know that during the times of Rabbi Yeshua, Hadrian was the king, and there were a number of persecutions against the Jewish people, most famously about not studying Torah. There were some others that we'll see later on. It's important to note there was no gzeira about Jewish clothing. Jews were free to dress, as far as we can tell, as they wanted. But these Jews changed the way they dressed. These Talmidim of Rabbi Yeshua changed the way they were dressing. Why did they change the way they were dressing? Very simple, because if you're going to learn Torah, you don't want the police saying, "Oh, there are two Jews walking. Maybe they're going to learn Torah. Let's follow them." This is you're more under the radar. You're under the radar. They think you're a Gentile, and so therefore, this is what they did. They went with they changed the cloak in a way that looked like a Gentile. Paga bahem sradyoit echad. So a Roman officer met them. Amar Lam and said, what's this double standard? If you're real children of Torah, so have Mesiras Nefesh for it. Be proud that you're Jewish. If you're not loyal to Torah, so then why Bechlal are you going to learn? Why are you having this type of Mesiras Nefesh? Amrulai, they said, Banei we are loyal to Torah, we are children of Torah. V'alei anu ne'aragim, we're willing to die for Torah. However, we're not committing suicide. And so therefore, it makes a lot of sense for us to conceal the fact that we're Jews so that we could go and learn Torah. We don't have to do it so in a public way that's going to cause us to die. We're not committing suicide. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, what's the whole thrust of this story? The whole thrust of this story was that normally, how did the Jews go? Normally they would go with distinctive clothing, which is why anyone would be able to tell you, oh, Dal Geit Ayid, here's a Jew who's going. And so, because it was Shas HaShmad, not that the Shmad was that you need to change clothing. The Shmad was you're not allowed to learn Torah. And because it was extenuating circumstances, they changed their clothes. So here's another source for the idea that Jews ought to have, in normal times at least, Jews need to have distinctive clothing. Next source is a halachic source. The Rambam in Hilchos Avedis Kachavim Mazalis Perek Yud Aleph says as follows: Ein Hilchim b'chukei Sedik Kachavim. We're not allowed to follow in Gentile ways. V'loi medam alehem. We're not allowed to try to be similar to them. Loi b'malbush, not in clothing. V'loi b'seyar, not with hair. V'chayeta vehen, or other things. Shenemar, and he quotes two psukim. Loi selchu b'chukas hagoyim. Don't follow the ways or the laws of the Gentiles. V'nemar v'chukasem le'selechu. Another verse that says essentially the same thing. Don't go in their ways. Elo, rather, yeh ha-Yisrael moved on my hand. A Jew should be separated from him v'yodua, and distinctive b'malbusha, in his clothing, of ishar ma'asav, and in his other deeds. Very clearly here, you have a statement in the Rambam that says Jews need to have distinctive clothing. The Tzemach Tzedek then adds another interesting source, another interesting idea, and that is the pasuk says in the end of Parshas Kedoshim, "Va'avdil eschem min ha'amim," I will separate you. It uses the lashon havdalah. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, that's interesting. The lashon of havdalah. We use havdalah, that term, between Shabbos and Chol. And guess what? For Shabbos and Chol, there's a chiyuv to have actually distinctive dress. In other words, you can make a halachic argument that whenever there needs to be havdalah, that havdalah has to express itself in clothing. And so therefore, tzarich liyashin levushim. That's an interesting argument Tzemach Tzedek adds on his own. So here are a few sources. We had a pasuk in Tzefanya, we had two midrashim, we had a Rambam, and then the Tzemach Tzedek's own argument, all of which seem to lean in the direction that a Jew needs to have clothing, and a distinctive clothing. And in fact, that it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah v'chukeseim leisei leichu. Once that becomes the case, then all of a sudden we're up the creek now. In 1844, we're up the creek. Why are we up the creek? Because we have a din of Mesiras Nefesh. When you learn this din of Mesiras Nefesh, the things you need to risk your life for, it's going to become apparent that if the government comes and says you need to violate any mitzvah, doesn't matter which one, any mitzvah, if the government is doing this in a way that they're trying to get Jews to stop keeping a mitzvah, then the din is yareg val yaver. You have to be willing to die. And if you have to be willing to die, all of a sudden that means that right now in Russia in 1844, we need to do everything possible to make sure that we don't give in, and we're not allowed to keep the law. We have to go against the law, even if it means death. Where does that come from? That comes from the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara says as follows: Kol avedus shebetoira, all avedus. Im omer l'adam aver v'al tareg. If a non-Jew tells a Jew, violate it, and so this way your life will be spared. Yavar val yareg. So indeed you should violate it. Don't allow yourself to get killed. Chutz me'avedus kechavim, gila arayis, and shvichas dam. Idolatry, certain illicit sexual relationships, and shvichas dam, and murder. Okay, this is not one of those three. Clothing is not one of those three. However, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he said as follows: Lo shanu. When do we say that it's only these three? Ela shaloi b'shas gzeres hamalchos, if the government doesn't issue decrees. Avol b'shas gzeres hamalchos, but if it's a gzera, then even if it's a mitzvah kala, for right now we'll just say any mitzvah, even if it's not a very significant one, any mitzvah. Yareg val yaver. Well, guess what? But this is a mitzvah kala. Clearly it's a mitzvah kala. The Rambam told us that it's one of alavim. It's chukas ein leisalechu, it's leisechu b'chukas agoy. All of the sources that we looked at before tell us that it's at least a mitzvah kala. Maybe it's more than a mitzvah kala, but at least it's a mitzvah kala. And so therefore, have we reached a point in 1844 where we say, Yareg val yaver? Okay, Gemara continues and says one other thing that's not negea right now, but will be negea later. Another exception. Even if there is no government persecution, when did we say it's only three things? If it's if it's in hiding, no one knows about it. If it's in public, then even if it's a mitzvah kala, yareg val yaver, even if it's a small mitzvah, yareg val yaver. So basically you have the rule and then you have two exceptions to the rule. The rule is you violate everything except for the big three in order to save your life. Then there are two exceptions. One exception is if government persecution, then we don't violate anything. The other exception is if it's in public, in front of 10 people, then also we don't violate anything. We have the din of Yareg Val Yav. Okay, so the implications here are very, very severe. And so therefore we need to make sure that we answer this question right, because it's mamish an issue of life and death. Okay. Now, once we're at this topic, let's pause now the analysis of the Tzemach Tzedek and point out that if this is the case, then maybe we have actually a challenge with the story of Yidden and Mitzrayim. We have a challenge to these sources. What's the challenge to these sources? So in this week's parsha, you look at number 10, we learn they borrowed, either borrowed or they asked for gifts, depending on which shita you want to go with, silver, gold, and smalais, garments, clothing. They took one second. They took garments from the Egyptians.
And they were commanded.
Number nine. Go back to Shmois Perek Gimel. V'shala isha mishchenta. Here the Eibishter is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu that the Jewish people should borrow klei chesav u'klei zav u'smalais u'samtem al b'neicha v'al b'nei seichem. They're going to give them to their children. So here we see that Jews are l'chayra taking Gentile clothing. Well, this is not going to be a problem. Why would this not be a problem? Because there are many different answers that could be given, and we're going to do two of them. One of them is the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer writes as follows: B'Mitzrayim, im Mitzrayim lo yishinu malbusheim. They in fact did not change their clothing. In other words, they didn't put it on in Mitzrayim. When they were in the desert on the way to Israel, then that's when they put it on. In fact, this reminded them of the nest. What's bothering the Chassam Sofer? What's bothering the Chassam Sofer is to imagine Jews in Egypt wearing Egyptian clothing, given all those sources that we spoke about earlier, is unimaginable. But on the other hand, once you leave Egypt, what's the problem? You're not living among them anymore, so there is no Isser. In fact, there's a Maila. What's the Maila? When you woke up in the morning and you put on your Egyptian garment, you remember the Nes, the Yetzias Mitzrayim, and so this was the purpose of taking out the smaller. There was a Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Shinova, whose name was Yecheskel Shraga Halberstam. His dates are 1815 to 1898. So he's mamish living during this tkufa of the Gzeira of the Levushim. And in his Sefer Divrei Yecheskel, he writes as follows. He asks the question, how come in Shmois it says that the garments you're going to put on your sons and daughters? You'd wear it yourself. Why is this? It makes it sound like it's about the kids. You know, sometimes parents blame things on the kids. It's for the kids. What is it? It's for the kids? You can use the garments yourself. So he says very simple. There's an Isser to wear an Egyptian garment. You're not allowed to wear it. So what's the only? But they borrowed it, or they were taking it. So what was the function? They were taking it, and then they cut it down and to change it. Once you're cutting it down and changing it, so obviously you don't have enough material for the adult, because once you start playing around with the garment, it doesn't fit. So they were able to use it in a way that it would fit the children, because of the changes that they made. But they were not able to wear it for the adult. It's like a shmaka pirush that he says. I'll go upon him. All of this was a derech agat. We saw in the first part of the shir, we saw all of the sources that Tzemach Tzedek brings that say there's an inyan in wearing Jewish clothing. The upshot of that, the second you recognize there's an inyan in Jewish clothing and a mitzvah in Jewish clothing, it's a mitzvah kala. Once it's a mitzvah kala, all of a sudden, right now in 1844, it seems that we're dealing with a yarei val yaver. However, it's not so simple. Maybe, in fact, it's not a mitzvah kala. Maybe it's not a mitzvah at all. Maybe, imagine the government said that instead of using a certain Kleenex when you're sneezing, you need to wear, when your nose is running, you need to use a different type of tissue. Okay, we wouldn't care, right? So maybe Jewish clothing is in the same category. Why? So here the Tzemach Tzedek proceeds to bring a whole bunch of sources that seem to say there is no inyan, there is no chiyuv at least, of wearing of wearing distinctive garments. So let's see these sources. Same tshuva, Siman Tzaddik Aleph. He says as follows. First, he brings from the Sifra. The Sifra is the Medrash Halacha on Sefer Vayikra. It says as follows. What is the verse of Chukei Leiselechu which Rambam brought before, told us you have to have distinctive garments? What does this verse really mean? It says the Sifra, don't follow their customs, kigoin, for example, teitarios, theaters, notice it's mamish the same word, kirkasios, circuses. Remember the word circus is a C. So if you pronounce that C as a hard C, it's the same word. Karkasois, veistarios, stadiums, circuses, stadiums, and theaters. These are things we shouldn't be going. Okay, this is the first shita. Now if you pause here, it sounds like that's all. Garments aren't mentioned there. It's only those types of things. Going to a gladiator fight in Rome is off the table. Going to a horse race or whatever it is, it's not a discussion today exactly which sports is part of this is or not, but the point is that's the genre of things that V'chukei Hashem Leiselechu is talking about. The Meir Omer, Elu Darchei Amori Shemanu Chachamim. We have Darchei Amori. Darchei Amori is this term that Chazal use for a whole bunch of things that aren't Avodah Zarah, but they're related to Avodah Zarah. Superstitious things that are about dealing with talking to ghosts, for example, and other type of nichushim is what it's referring to. So that's what it's talking about. Okay, so then again, that's not dealing with clothing. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, it refers to 3 types of haircuts that a person is not allowed to take, and he says the word shaloi sinchar, shaloi tzegadel tzitzis, v'shaloi tispar koimi safa. So these are 3 types of haircuts. We're not going to get into the difference of what each one is, but okay, here you see, that's maybe getting a little closer, but at the end of the day, the Tzemach Tzedek says, when you read this medrash, you don't see anything here about clothing, and so therefore you could say clothing is not part of it. In fact, from the fact that it didn't bring clothing, tells you clothing is not part of it. Then he brings a Paisik. Remember before we had the Rambam? So here it said, at the same time of the Rambam, in Ashkenaz, there was a Yid by the name of Rabbi Elazar of Metz, who wrote a Sefer Yereim. He passed away 1198. And around 1198, and his sefer says as follows: you want to know what this prohibition is? In the Tosefta the Shabbos, the same thing that Reb Meir was referring to, the Darchei Amori, that's where they enumerated all the things that are part of their laws that you're not allowed to keep. Like one of them, we once spoke about wearing a red string, for example, is one of the things that's listed there as a Darchei Amori. Don't add. You're not allowed to use reason here. Kim Kabbalah, it's a tradition. So you can't add to the list. And guess what? Clothing is not part of the list. Then the Tzemach Tzedek brings the following medrash. The medrash says, Amar Reb Levi, this is Bamidbar Rabbah. The deeds of Jews are different from the Gentiles. And then it enumerates Bachari Shasan, how we plow a field. Why? Because we're not allowed to plow with a shur and a chamor together. Uvizri Yasan, how we plant, because we're not allowed to do kalayim, 2 types of seeds together. Biksi Rasan, the way we cut a field, because you have to leave payah. Ba'oimran, the way we gather the bundles, because there's dinah shikha, bidi shasan. He goes on, he gives 7 or 8 different things over here. The bottom line is, in this list, there is no clothing. So here again, it does seem to say that yes, we're separate from the Gentiles in many different behaviors. However, clothing is not one of them. Then what the Tzemach Tzedek does is, he brings a tshuva from an earlier Rishon. He brings from a Rishon. Who's the Rishon? The Maharik. Maharik is Rabbi Yosef Kalon. Rabbi Yosef Kalon lived in Italy in the 1400s. And he there is dealing with the following issue. Basically, there was another rabbi at the time whose name was Rabbi Yehuda Messer Leon. And Rabbi Yehuda Messer Leon received an honorary degree from the emperor, which allowed him, if you had an honorary degree, it allowed him to wear a special cape. Kappa is the word in the Tshuva that no one else would wear. Then there was a lot of rules and regulations in Gentile society, Bechlal, about what you could wear and what, if you're part of this class, you can wear a certain type of garment. Anyway, because he had this honorary degree, now he could wear this special cape, and he wanted to. People said, maybe you're not allowed to, and so the whole tshuva, they asked the Maharik, Rabbi Yosef Kalon, and there's an entire tshuva about the whole issue of wearing Gentile clothing. And so, obviously, it's very relevant. So the Tzemach Tzedek brings the Maharik. One of the things the Maharik points to, the Marik's main argument there is, he says a number of things, and we're not going to get into all the details, but one of his points is that there is no obligation to wear distinctive Jewish clothing. And he points to the following Gemara in Me'ilah. The Gemara in Me'ilah, Daf Yuzayin Amar Aleph says as follows. Once the Romans made a gzeira that you should not keep Shabbos, you should not give a bris milah, circumcised children, v'yishivalu es nidos, and there should be no mikvah. Women should not be able to go to the mikvah, so that by definition the men and women will be violating the isser, the prohibition of nida. So what do? So a man by the name of Reb Ruvain ben Isterubuli, he went to Rome. But what he did was v'siper koimi. He took a Roman haircut. In other words, he looked like a Roman. And the Gemara goes on to say that he came to the Roman government and he said like this: Jews, we don't like the Jews, right? They assumed he was a Gentile. We don't like the Jews. So if you don't like the Jews, let them not work on Shabbos. They'll have less money. Let them give circumcision to their children. They'll make them weak. Let them keep the laws of mikveh, which means that they're having relations less frequently, and so therefore they'll have less children. This is the type of thing we would want for our enemy. So people say, something, it's a great idea. And so they rescinded all the decrees. Then the Gemara says they found out, he's really a Jew, so they put all the decrees back on, which is why Reb Shimon Bar Yochai had to come later, and through some miracle he was able to get all the decrees off. Says the Ma'arik, 1 second, he just changed his haircut, and then they thought he was a guy? How's that possible? Muzman Zagin, then garments, there was no difference. In other words, many Jews wore the non-Jewish garment. The only thing he needed to do was to change his haircut. So from here is a raya that during this time, unlike other sources that we saw earlier, Jews had Jews wore regular clothing. This is what the Ma'arik says in Siman Peiches. Then the Ma'arik brings another argument. The other argument that the Ma'arik brings us back to the Gemara that we saw earlier, the one that says that you need to have Mesiras Nefesh for a mitzvah kala. If the government says that you're not allowed to keep a certain mitzvah, so then Yareg Val Yaver, we have to be willing to die. So let's read this carefully. So the Gemara asks as follows: My mitzvah kala. What's an example of a mitzvah kala? What do we mean when we say mitzvah kala? Amar Rava bar Rav Yitzchak Amar Rav. So what's the answer? Afilu lishenuye arkasa demesana. Even to change the arkasa demesana. So even to change the arkasa demesana is not allowed, and the government says you need to do it, you're not allowed to do it, and even be willing to die. So Rashi needs to explain to us, what does it mean, arkasa demesana? What is it, right? When we read our list of the Tayag mitzvahs, we don't know, on that list, we don't see the mitzvah of arkasa demesana. So what is this referring to? Says Rashi, arkasa demesana means sroi chanal. It means the shoelace. If the non-Jews tie it in a certain way, and the Jews do it differently. But now look, why do the Jews do it differently? Rashi felt the need to explain why the Jews do it differently. Kigoin, for example, there's a Jewish reason. There's a reason of Judaism. Yahadus. There's a reason of Judaism for why they do it differently. Because the Jews are modest. In other words, there's two ways to make a bow. There's two ways to make a knot. One is an immodest way, one is a modest way. Or maybe there's two colors you could have on your shoelace. One is a modest color and one is an immodest color. So if the Jews have a modest way and the Gentiles have an immodest way, this is what we mean when we say mitzvah kala. There is no mitzvah here. There's not a real thing here. There's not one of the 613 commandments. It's a minig ba'alma. Still, you kaddish as Hashem. You have to go and kiddush Hashem over here. Says Maria, hold on a second. What did Rashi do? He busied himself. He went out of his way to say that the case is talking about this is a Jewish reason, which is namely modesty and tznius, for why you need to preserve the Jewish way of doing things. In other words, if the Jews happen to do their shoelace in one way, and the Gentiles happen to do it another way, but there is no argument of tznius for one way or the other, they're both equally tznius. Then does this whole Gemara apply? No, the whole Gemara doesn't apply. The whole Gemara only applies if there's a Jewish cause, a Jewish reason for why you should be doing it. So therefore, says the Marik, what do you see from here? There is no argument for Jewish clothing. Because otherwise, what Rashi would have just said is, there's a value in Jewish clothing. It's one of the 613 mitzvahs. And so therefore, if they said to change it, then you're not allowed to change it. Rashi didn't say that. You know why he didn't say that? Because there's no such thing. So therefore, he had to come up with a different thing. There is a command, there's a minig for tznius. If it's a violation of a minig for tznius, so then taka is Indian Jewish clothing. And that's what Marik's point is. Marik's point is like this. To be separate from Gentiles or different from Gentiles, is there such a thing? No. Oh, if they have a certain type of garment that's not tzniistic, then yes, then. And so therefore he says, if something is immodest in dress, if it's too showy or something like that, then it's taka a Jewish value to not wear that type of garment. That goes under the category of mitzvah kala, which, by the way, teaches us a very, very serious thing. It's something that needs to be taken seriously. But other than that, there is no value in something that Jews just happen to be wearing at a certain time. So the Tzemach Tzedek brings all of these sources. So where does that leave us? Where that leaves us is that in the Siman Tzaddik Aleph of the Tzemach Tzedek, we have two lists. We have one list of sources that tells us there's a value in Jewish clothing. It's value, it's even a mitzvah. And we saw another list of sources that basically tell us there is no value in Jewish clothing, putting the issue with tznius aside, which was not an issue in Russia. It's not like the command was, by the way, that you need to change modest clothing for immodest clothing. The alternative was modest as well. So you have these two different paths. So how are we supposed to go about it? And the nafkamina is huge. Why? Because it's literally, as of now, the way we're thinking right now, the nafkamina is, can I say, it's a say, the government told me that instead of using this tissue, I need to use a different type of tissue. No problem, I'm listening. Or do you say, the government told you that you need to stop doing a certain Jewish observance that's important, and so therefore, because it's coming from the government, it's shas hashmad, and so therefore, yarek val yaver. Now what's interesting is that we have a psak in the Shulchan Aruch. The Mechaber follows the Rambam, which is very usual. The Mechaber writes in Yeridei Kuf Ayin Ches, V'lo yilbash malbush hamyuchad lahem, do not wear the type of garment that is unique to them. Okay, that's mamish what the Rambam would say. However, comes the Ramah, and the Ramah says as follows. This is only when do we say that a Jew is not allowed to wear Gentile clothing? Only if the Gentile clothing is one that is immodest. For example, the red clothing, which is very showy and ostentatious, so that's unacceptable. Or if they're wearing garments in a way, a certain garment in a way that we don't know why they're wearing a specific garment, so then you have to worry. Maybe it's darchei amoiri, maybe it's some superstitious thing. So then it's a problem. Then we need to worry about darchei amoiri. But absent those two factors, there's no issue whatsoever. The Ramah basically paskins like the second way that we saw. So you would think that the Tzemach Tzedek is under the influence of the Ramah. It's a psak in Shulchan Aruch, and so therefore you would say, end the story, we could end our case right here. The Ramah basically tells us there's no issue of Jewish clothing whatsoever, and so therefore it's the example I gave you before of changing one tissue for another tissue, and so therefore it's not a problem. Interestingly, the Tzemach Tzedek does not do this. Why he doesn't do this, I don't know. You actually have to have a broader understanding of the Tzemach Tzedek's tshuvas, and that is, how did he treat the Shulchan Aruch? In other words, if you have a lot of sources, did he say Shulchan Aruch is the final word on all matters? Or did he feel that, no, you actually have to analyze all the sources and let the chips fall where they fall? I don't know enough to be able to weigh in on that. The fact is, over here, he doesn't even cite the Shulchan Aruch. Doesn't cite not the Mechaber and not the Ramah, and he leaves off the tshuva in a way where he basically doesn't say, he brings all the sources for this way, he brings all the sources for that way, and we're kind of therefore left. It's a little bit of enigma. So what is it, Tzemach Tzedek's psak? Is there a chiyuv to wear Jewish clothing, or is there not a chiyuv to have Jewish clothing? So the truth is that there's another tshuva, the Tzemach Tzedek, which we're going to see in a second. And this tshuva is going to be Siman Tzaddik. What's going to happen in this tshuva? The whole thrust of Siman Tzaddik is going to be, even if you say that there is an obligation to wear Jewish clothing, even if you adopt the Rambam's approach that we saw earlier, even if you reject the Maharik's approach that says there's no inyan in Jewish clothing, I'm going to come up with a reason why here we don't have to worry about it in this unique case, because of the reasons that he's going to enumerate in Siman Tzaddik. So it could be that Tzemach Tzedek basically felt that he didn't need to weigh in here and he didn't need to say what the final halacha is like, because what's the benefit of doing that? At the end of the day, there are people who are going to want to follow the other opinion, who want to follow, because there are many, many sources that seem to say that there is a mitzvah to have Jewish clothing. So therefore the Tzemach Tzedek feels that that's not the main work. The main work is not to say if that view is right or wrong. The main work is to say, even if you accept that work, is there a heter nonetheless? And that's the work that's the thing, that's the material that the Tzemach Tzedek does in Siman Tzaddik. Okay, before we get there, I just want to talk about the minig for a second. We have these two paths. So what was the minig? So you can ask this question every time and every place. What was the minig? And the answer actually is going to be different. I want to just show one example of this. On the one hand, this tshuva, the Ma'arik, he writes along the way, he writes as follows. She'ein b'doyer hazeh, in our generation, there is no person shelo yilbash levush hadoimim lulvush zikneim or lulvush yaldeim. Everyone has clothing that's either similar to the older Gentiles or to the younger Gentiles. How can anyone get up and say that there's a prohibition over here? We know that Rabbanim are very sensitive when everyone is doing something a certain way. They're very sensitive for if someone's going to come and say, you got it all wrong, you're doing it wrong. That's what's happening. The Ma'arik is writing in Italy in the 1400s. He's saying everyone here is basically wearing clothes, Gentile clothing. So that's what he's talking about. That's his reality. That's he's talking about in the 1400s in Italy. On the other hand, there is the concept of Vad Arba Aratzos. This was a body of political leaders, Jewish political leaders and Rabbanim, that were basically the government for Jews that were living in Poland 1500s, 1600s, through the 1700s. And there was once a ledger that had all their takanos that they made. This was lost. I believe during World War II it disappeared. But there was an author who went around and found many places that quoted from this ledger or their takanos, and he put out a sefer. It's called the Pinkas Vad Arba Aratzos. So over there he has a takana from the year 1607, and it says as follows. This is Poland. L'sakein, all the communities need to make a takana. Shelo yilbashu ha'anashim v'ha'anashim b'malbushei ha'goyim. Men and women should not wear non-Jewish clothing. Hanahugim b'avanetzenu rabbim, which is common. Jews should be distinctive with their clothing. So you see here 2 points. On the one hand, we see that in 1607 there were a lot of Jews who were starting to wear Gentile clothing. But on the other hand, we see that here the Rabbanim's position was, no, we should fight this. And they felt that they could fight it. And they felt that there would be enough people who would listen to them and say that this is unacceptable. And we know that in Eastern Europe, for the most part, Jews taka. There were always exceptions, but for the most part, till the time of the Samach Tzedek, Jews were, at least the majority of Jews, were wearing this distinctive clothing that Pauline Wennegroff describes at great length over there. So you see kind of the minig kind of went both ways. It really depends on the time and on the place. But as I said, the Tzemach Tzedek gave us these two shittas. One shitta is a mitzvah to wear distinctive clothing. The other says there is no such a thing. The difference is huge. What the Tzemach Tzedek is therefore going to do now is going to have, in Simon Tzaddik, he's going to say, let's assume you're right, that there is chukasein le'salechu, means that you're not allowed to have non-Jewish clothing. Nonetheless, I'd like to present a heter for why it's okay for us in this case to change our clothing because of the Tsar's decree in 1844. So in order to understand this tshuva, we need to go back to the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Ayin Dal. Says the Gemara as follows. We learned before that in public, Yareg Val Yaver. The whole concept of there's only 3 mitzvahs that you die for is not true, is only true in private. In public, Yareg Val Yaver. In fact, the Gemara, we have a problem. What's the problem? Esther was in public. Everyone knew she's being taken to Achashverosh. And there isn't the issue of Gila Aroyas here, because when we say Gila Aroyas, Yareg Val Yaver, we mean like a Ish, adultery, relations between a Jewish woman and a guy. Tosfos assumes doesn't rise to the level of Gila Aroyas that Yareg Val Yaver. But the Gemara's question is, it was in public. Everyone knew Esther is being taken. So even if it's a regular Aveira, shouldn't she have said, no, kill me because this is an Aveira and it's in public? So the Gemara gives 2 answers. One answer is Esther Karka Olam Hoisa. This is Abaye's answer. What's Abaye's answer? So Rashi explains that what he means here is what Abaye means here is as follows. Esther's Aveira here would be completely passive. And that is, the sexual act for a woman is not being active, passive, and the rule doesn't apply if you're being Avodah Zarah, you're being active. Gila Royas for a man, being active. Shvichas Damin, you're being active. So then, Yareg Val Yaver. But if you're being passive, then even if it's Parasya, we don't care. That's Abaye's answer. Rava answers a different answer. Hanas Achman Sha'ani. What does this mean? That Achashverosh here wasn't trying to make Esther do an Aveira. He wasn't focused on Esther's spiritual standing. He wasn't focused on Esther's religion. He's focused on his own pleasure. If you focus on his own pleasures, then okay, we don't care if it's Farasya. Now, a whole discussion, but the Tzemach Tzedek assumes that just like these 2 factors take away the farhesya, meaning that if it's done in public, you don't have to worry, you don't have to die, even if it's in public. So too, it takes away the other thing, and that is if the government is doing it in a ifin of when the Gemara is is doing it b'shas hashma. It's Gzeres HaMalchus. If you have a Gzeres HaMalchus, so then if you're passive, Abaye, if you're Esther, Karka Olam, if you're passive, you don't have to worry about it. Okay. Problem is that wearing Jewish clothing is not passive. Fine. But the point is, we want to assume anything that's permitted if it's paresya is also going to be permitted b'shas hashma. Now, the Tzemach Tzedek says as follows. He comes up with a very interesting idea, and he establishes this with sources. We're not going to have the ability to get into these sources. We'll just see what he says. He argues, if there's any factor of their own personal hana, even if it's a mixture of coercing Jews to violate their religion, you don't have to go on Mesiras Nefesh. Wow. So what's the idea here? All of a sudden we're learning that, what do we say about Esther? Oh, Achashverosh didn't intend to convert her, to get her to go against her religion. He only wanted his hana. Tzemach Tzedek says, what if it's a mix? What if it's both? I want you to go against your religion, but really there's also my motives here for my own pleasure. So Tzemach Tzedek says, I think it's the same thing. I think it's the same thing, meaning that all of a sudden it doesn't go under the category that you need a yarag val yaver. How is that relevant? So here he says, V'nidon shenishal, Siman Tzaddik is written to someone. Tzaddik Aleph doesn't look like it was written to anyone. It's like an essay that Tzemach Tzedek wrote, the two shittis. But here he's writing to him. V'nidon shenishal, the question that you asked, Vaday murkav al kolponim ha'anas hatzman. Definitely, the government has their own personal hana that's a part of this decree. What's their own personal hana? Shal yedei ha'abasha yeh kezrach hayaretz. That through this, Jews will be like regular citizens. Jews will not see themselves as foreigners. The ministers of the government care about this. Maybe the government wants that it should be like in those countries where there is equality. There's more brotherly love among citizens. This is the government hana. That Jews shouldn't separate themselves from the Gentile population. Another reason why the government may want this is one of the distinctive clothes that Jews would wear, which was banned, was wearing silk. Why are you wearing silk? Silk is fancy. So the governments at that time would say, why are you wearing fancy clothing where you're then lifting yourself up and you're saying you're better than the peasants who are living around you who don't have that ability. So in other words, Tzemach Tzedek here lays out social arguments, social reasons why a government would want to tell Jews not to wear their distinctive dress. And therefore he says, maybe there's lahaver al das, maybe the motive here is to move Jews away from their mitzvah, because we're assuming now there is a mitzvah to wear distinctive Jewish clothing, but at the end of the day, that's not their only motive. It's not their sole focus is to get you to go away from your mitzvah. They have their own interest. And because they have their own interest over here, so therefore it's Hanas Atman. Once it's Hanas Atman, we learned that by Esther, Hanas Atman meant that it was different, and suddenly it was permitted. And so therefore, Hanas Atman here as well is going to be permitted. Then he goes further and says, V'oid, al kopanim bahama anes. There's the bureaucrat, there's the government ministers who are sitting in Petersburg who make the decree, but then there's the police officer on the street who's the one who executes it. And in him, you think that police officer says, you have a certain way in your religion and I want you to go against your religion? They don't care about that. They're just trying to do their job. And so because they're trying to do their job, so then the idea of, they're trying to get me to go against my religion, that's not here in him. And so therefore that's another factor that could be mixed in. These are major chidushim. Because with Achashverosh we understand what's happening. Achashverosh doesn't care about religion. He's not thinking about religion. He's not trying to change anything in the Jewish community. He's not trying to impact the Jewish community. He's not trying to change anything. He just wants to have pleasure, and so therefore we say, fine, that's different. But here, you have a government policy that's trying to change an area of Jewish life, very clearly trying to change the area of Jewish life. And somehow the Tzemach Tzedek is able to say, but you know something? It's not lahaver al das. And you need to ask yourself, what is lahaver al das then? Which government decree is lahaver al das? Because when the Romans banned Milah, or when the Romans banned Shabbos, or when the Yevseksia and the Russians and the Soviets banned certain things, you can't come up with similar arguments? The distinction between the people who make the policy and the officers who execute it? I think you could. Can you not make the distinction that he's talking about that? There's a certain argument, they want equality amongst people and social cohesion amongst people. I think you could. You really need to think well about what the Tzemach Tzedek is doing over here. It does seem like to be a major chiddush. Now, he recognizes that, and that's why he adds another heter. We just saw heter number 1, now we're going to do heter number 2. What's heter number 2? He brings a very interesting medrash. The medrash says in Shmois Rabbah that a mayor says that when the Jews said Nasa v'nishma, at that very moment, their heart was not in it. Vayefatu b'fiyim, they tricked God with their lips. They expressed dedication, but really in their heart they weren't loyal to Hashem, which is why negative things happen later. Okay. Now at the same time, the Tzemach Tzedek says we know that Yidden were rewarded for Nasa v'nishma. So what does that teach us? If you put these two midrashim together, that on the one hand it was only the lips that were speaking, and on the other hand, nonetheless, Hashem rewarded that. What do you see? It's a very interesting argument because it's all based on midrashim. 1 second. It's all based on midrashim. The argument is that we take into consideration what you say, even if we know you don't mean it. Because Hashem did that. Hashem took into consideration what the Jews were saying, even though He knew they weren't meaning it. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, look at 26, even if the government's motives is no good. Here the Tzemach Tzedek is willing to concede that the government's motives here is no good. They want to get us to stop keeping our observance. Halacha takes into consideration what goes on in the mouth. Because the government is saying, the government is saying, we don't want to touch religion. What's happening? The government, obviously, PR, they came and said, we don't mind Jews, we love Jews, and we love Judaism, we don't have a problem with that. And we don't want to mess with the Jewish religion. We just have these few weeks that are important. So even if you don't believe that, and even if you say that really they just want to destroy Jews and Judaism and Jewish identity, but at the end of the day, because the lips are saying it, halacha needs to take that into consideration. So Yesh Loimar, Dagan Milsi, we could say that that's also something. So what's a gzeira? A gzeira is when they come and they hold a gun to your head and say, go against your religion. Here they're coming, maybe with a gun, but they're not saying go against your religion. They're saying we love your religion, we just need you to change this. And to therefore the Tzemach Tzedek said that's a second factor to say why maybe it is okay. Then he says another point. Rashi points out in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, why Bechlal do we have this rule that if it's Shas Hashmad, if it's Shas Gzeira, then we draw a very stark line and we say we're not going to violate everything. Why? Why does that make sense? So Rashi says, "Shelo yargilu ha'oivdei kechavim lahamrich es halavavois lakach." It's interesting. We want to make sure if you give in here, they're going to come for the next thing. They're going to come for the next thing. They're going to come for the next thing. It's never going to end. You're going to basically get them used to saying, you want to oppress Jews? This is what you could do. It's so we don't allow them to get used to oppressing Jews. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, that makes sense. But here, normally that makes sense. Here they're telling you, this is all we want. We don't want anything else. We have no problem with Judaism. We have no problem with the Jewish religion. This is the only thing we want. So the whole reason, the whole logic doesn't apply here. And the Lashon of the Tzedek says, V'chiven she'omer lishmar hadas, because the government is saying that they want to protect the Jewish religions, yesh lamar d'lo shayechen, so the whole reason doesn't apply. So that's the third heter that the Tzemach Tzedek brings. And now we'll do there's two more. We're doing 5 heterim. So now is heter number 4. Heter number 4 brings us back to what we learned before about Esther Karka Olam Oisa. What was this? We saw that although we say normally B'farhesia, you need to be willing to give up your life. Esther was B'farhesia, she didn't give up her life. Why Karka Olam? So how do we interpret it before? She wasn't being active in the Avera, she was being passive. There you don't, even if it's Gila Aroyas, even if it's no matter what it is, if you're being passive, you don't have to worry about it. There is another interpretation of Karka Olam from the Ran. The Ran gives a different interpretation. He says as follows. What's Esther going to do? Esther's going to say, no, kill me. What's going to happen? They're going to take her. They're going to rape her. So the event is going to happen anyway, and they're going to kill her too. Maybe they'll kill her too. In other words, when do we normally say Yareg Val Yaver? When it's a case where either you're going to do Chilul Shabbos, if you're not going to do Chilul Shabbos, then they're going to kill you. But what if it's a situation where you're going to do the Chilul Shabbos because they're going to force you to do the Chilul Shabbos, so then the whole din doesn't apply. This is what he says. That's what Karka Olam says. He reads this into the word Karka Olam. That there, what's going to happen is they're going to force her anyway to do it. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, that's very relevant over here in our case. Why? Because you're going to be a Yid, you're going to say, Yara, you're going to wake up in the morning in 1844, you're going to say, Yara Val Yaver, I'm going to wear the Yiddish Lavush like Hillel Parasher with my long payas and my long kapata, and I'm going to go out and I'm ready to die. What's going to happen? Says the Tzemach Tzedek like this. If the punishment was that they're going to kill you, So then you could say, Yarek Val Yaver, die. Aval hacha yesh lachshoish. Here we need to worry. Chas v'shalom shenoisnim l'anshei chayil. What are they going to do? They're going to take you and they're going to make you a cantonist. They're going to send you off to the military. Vin Kane, what's going to happen? You're only going to end up doing many, many more avedis. So let's be smart about this. If you're going to die, one thing, but you're not dying. What's going to happen is many, many more avedis you're going to do. Sheyuchrach lavar al kama avedis chas v'shalom. In Kane ma yoyom lo yaver. How does that help you? So this is what he does. His argument is rooted in the Ran, who told us that Esther Karka Oila means that she had no way of basically avoiding the Avera. Is anyway going to happen. It's the same thing. Your clothes are anyway going to change because they're going to force you into the army. They're going to take off your payas. They're going to take off your clothes and many other Avedas as well. This is the fourth argument for why the Tzemach Tzedek says you don't. We can go ahead and change the clothing. The final argument that he says is, what if you don't want to accept this one? He says another point, and that is Yesh Letzadeh, the number 31, Kiva in Kfar Kama Alafim Hilbishu. You have many thousands of Jews who already changed their clothing. In other words, even if you want to accept the idea that there's a Yiddish Lavush, and this is what we have been accepting throughout the entire Tshuva Tzaddik. We're accepting that there is a concept of a Yiddish Lavush. Fine. But now it's not a Yiddish Lavush anymore. In other words, or you could say Yiddish Lavush has changed. Because the Goyish Lavush, the non-Jewish Lavush, has become so common. Because many thousands of Russian Jews have already started wearing it. So therefore, this is part of the Jewish Lavush. Once it's part of the Jewish Lavush, there is no Isser for wearing it. And this is the fifth reason why he thinks that there is no issue over here. So what's, in summary, what happens is as follows. What you need to remember is like this. You have two tshuvas of the Tzemach Tzedek. Tshuva Tzaddik Aleph gets into the discussion. Is there a mitzvah to wear Jewish clothing or not? The Tzemach Tzedek never resolves that. He gives you sources that imply that there is. He gives you sources that imply that there isn't. Tshuva Tzaddik then goes and basically says, even if you want to assume that there is a chiyuv to wear Jewish lavush, and it is a chukasein leisleichu, and there's such a thing, and it's an important value. Nonetheless, the idea that once it's a mitzvah kala, so therefore yarag v'yavar, and so therefore we shouldn't wear the Jewish lavush. We shouldn't listen to the decree and continue. We should continue wearing the Jewish lavush. The Tzemach Tzedek says actually that's not the case, and basically there's a heter. The Tzemach Tzedek gives a very strong heter here that Jews should go ahead and change their clothing, which we know many Jews actually did at that time. So now you understand what we said earlier. We said earlier that the Tzemach Tzedek said, if I would have known what levushim are payal, I would have had Mesiras Nefesh. Now you understand what happened, because he wrote his tshuva where he basically said that you don't need to have Mesiras Nefesh for it. And we just saw, we went through the whole process. What this tradition is saying, how reliable it is, I don't know. But what the tradition here is saying is that the Tzemach Tzedek looked back. And he said, oh wow, had I known how much clothing actually affects a person, then I would have had Mesiras Nefesh. There were other Rabbanim, I mentioned before, Reb Shlomo Kluber, there were other Rabbanim who said, Yarek Val Yaver, Jews have to try to leave Russia, but you're not allowed to listen to this decree. And guess what? One of them was Hillel Paracher. We saw before the story of Hillel Paracher that he violated, he didn't listen to the decree, he had his long pace. But in addition to the fact that he had his long payas, we have an account of Reb Menachem Mendel Novikov, who he wrote a whole bunch of different maises and stories, and he writes as follows. Once Hillel Parasha was sitting with the Tzemach Tzedek, and they were having a debate. Do you need to have Mesiras Nefesh for clothing or not? You understand the context of what's happening. The Tzemach Tzedek said, you don't need to have Mesiras Nefesh, ki ein kavanasam lahaver al dos. They don't want, it doesn't fall under the halachic category of them forcing you to go against Judaism. We know exactly what he means now that we saw the tshuva. Va'atzadik Reb Hillel said, no, you need to have Mesiras Nefesh. The Reb Hillel Paracher went with the other shita. And this makes sense based on the story that we saw on the outside of the lesson. Okay, so Venishar Bedaitam, this is really interesting. They said, you know what, we're going to ask the Ruzhana. The Ruzhana by this time is not living in Russia anymore. They're going to ask the Ruzhana. And so there was a Rav from Chachnik, whose name was Reb Feivish. He was there, and they said they're going to send him to Ruzhin. They gave him a letter, and he went to the Ruzhana Rebbe, and the Ruzhana Rebbe said as follows: Chachnik Rav, when Yaakov Avinu received the brachis from his father Yitzchak, he was also wearing non-Jewish clothing. He was wearing the clothing of Big Day Esav. And so therefore, the Tzemach Tzedek is right that it's okay to go ahead and to change the clothing. What you're able to see over here is that Hillel Paracher, and there's a number of stories and pisgamim of Hillel Paracher. In fact, in his Sefer Pelach Harimoin, he has a line over there, which he writes. He explains what levushim are according to Chassidus, It's in the Shir Hashirim section of his Sefer. He wrote Maimarim, Biurim on Maimarim. And he writes over there, V'lachein tzarich kol ish Yisrael liyis muvdo b'levushim me'akum. Every Jew needs to be separate, b'chtei sheyeh ha'kedusha demakifim shoyra aleim, so that he could have the kedusha that is present within garments. So there's, just to conclude and say the following. There's a letter, forget the letter. If you're interested in this topic, there's an essay that was written in the journal called Heichal Abal Shem Tov, and I don't remember which volume, volume 11, volume 12, by a scholar who's passed away. His name was Reb Amram Blau. He wrote a lot about this with a lot of additional sources, and he goes through as many Hasidic Rebbes as possible, trying to identify what their position was on this particular issue. So that's a small taste of a very big and complex subject that had very, very significant consequences. And when you look at your dress today, and I think we would say about ourselves that we follow both shittas at the same time. I think on the one hand, there's a lot about our clothing that it very much reflects the general society that we live in. But if only for a yarmulke on our heads, which I know we wear for other reasons, or tzitzis dangling outside of our pants, that itself is probably the other shit of having some sort of distinction in our begadim. So maybe you could say that our life today is some merging of the two. There is a letter of the Rebbe in Igros Kodesh Chelik Chaf that says as follows. Someone wanted to know, is there an Indian in having Jewish levush? Is there an Indian having a Jewish levush? So the Rebbe wrote as follows. I'm surprised that you have any doubt. You bring in your letter Ma'amorei Chazal and Piskei Dinim Hamachayvim es Inyan. Why are you in doubt whether there's an Inyan in a Jewish levush? You bring in your letter the Ma'amorei Chazal, we saw them before, and Piskei Dinim, we saw them before, for example, the Rambam, who suggests that this is a must. See as well, Shut of the Tzemach Tzedek Chelek Yeridei, Siman Tzaddik Aleph, that's a siman that gives both. Meyusad al Akasav, which is based, which he has that pasuk in Tzafanya, which also says is in. Okay, now if you stop here. This is, some people look at this. Oh, the Rebbe seems to be saying there's an obligation to have a Jewish levush. I'm not sure. Or you say the Rebbe is saying, why are you questioning whether there's an Inyan? There's plenty of sources that say there's an Inyan. There's a significant difference between those two. Anyway, the letter continues and says as follows. You point out that in Lekutei Deburim there's a Sikha of the Frierdiker Rebbe, where the Frierdiker Rebbe says that in Mitzrayim lo yishinu es levusham. We saw sources about that earlier. The Frierdiker Rebbe says that refers to a beard and payas. So maybe you can make an argument that the Frierdiker Rebbe is, by quoting that, is suggesting that beard and payas is enough and you don't need anything further. So the Rebbe says that's unacceptable. It can't be that the Frierdiker Rebbe, we know what the Chazal means. That teaching means levushim. It says levushim. So if it says levushim, ein mikra yotzei midei pshutoy, it's not mikra, but the ein maimer zeh yotzei midei pshutoy. And so therefore you have to take a literal. So you must say that the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying that in addition to clothing is also that. So what's this letter? Is this letter a psak din? I know that it does sound that way. On the other hand, I'm not sure because the language of the Rebbe doesn't say there's a psak din clear in Shulchan Aruch that you need to have a Yiddish levush. What it does say is there's a lot of very, very important sources that say it's an Inyan, and there's a lot of important sources that say it's obligatory. So therefore, there shouldn't be a question as to whether it's a good thing or not. Of course, it's a good thing. You want to get into the nitty-gritty of whether the Rebbe is saying here that it's halachic chiyuv mamish or not halachic chiyuv mamish. I don't know that we could. I don't know that we could derive anything specific from that. I would go back to the Tzemach Tzedek for a second. Even the letter of the Tzemach Tzedek, where he says lays out two things. If you would come on a bright sunny day to the Tzemach Tzedek when there is no issue, and you say, should I wear Jewish levush? Of course he's going to say yeah. There he was forced to get into the halachic question, is there an obligation? Is there mamish obligation? So he said, if you want to get into the question of obligation, and if you want to know historically what happened, there's two kavim. And so he lays out all the sources for the two kavim. I don't think anyone questions whether he would say on a regular day what a Jew should do, what his recommendation would be. I think we know what his recommendation would be, and I think that's what's happening here in this letter of the Rebbe. But the result is, there are those who say that there were certain kreis in Chassidus that their Rebbe said, Yareg val yaver, you're not allowed to change your clothes whatsoever. And those kreis in Chassidus, the men still wear pants that go only down to their knee. all the Russian men would wear the pants that would go down to the knee without going all the further down. Whereas those who like in Lubavitch, there was much more of a change of dress. So some people look and say maybe this is the place to understand it. But at the end of the day, everyone had change. Everyone wears buttons. There's no one who doesn't wear buttons now. So there's some degree of change happened across the board.